Welcome to today's event. I am Dr. Amani Morrison, and I am the lead primary principal investigator for the Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Creative Placemaking, Black Restorative Ecologies, and Black Spatial Futures. This is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it has been a 2+ year set of inquiry into thinking about what it means to make place in the kind of Black US and beyond, what it means to excavate ecological paths, to think about how we might plan for ecological futures, particularly as it relates to histories and realities of kind of Black people and Black places, especially in the US. Today's event, Black Afterlife of the Forest, is presented by Dr. Danielle Purifoy, who I'll introduce shortly. This talk uses a Black Ecologies framework to explore the transition period between the immediate pre-Civil War era to the late 20th century, when US forests transformed from spaces of refuge and colonial uncertainty to state-run recreation spaces imbued with whiteness and specific angst for Black people. How did this transition happen? What can be reclaimed of the very long and symbiotic relationships between Black people and forests, land, and waterscapes? So this will be the focus of today's talk, and thereafter we'll have a conversation that I'll be discussing with Dr. Purifoy, and we welcome you all's questions and comments at that time. Dr. Danielle Purifoy, JD and PhD, is an assistant professor of geography and environment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she also serves as a faculty project lead for the UNC Environmental Justice Action Research Clinic. She's also currently with Dunbar and Oaks here locally. Danielle's research intersects geography, law, environmental studies, and Black studies to learn about Black placemaking processes from town formation to ecological stewardship. She is the former Race and Place editor of Scalawag, a media organization devoted to Southern storytelling, journalism, and the arts. You can find her work in Society and Space, and also the American Association of Geographers, Inside Higher Ed, Environmental Sociology, Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, Scalawag, Oxford American, and Southern Cultures, among other publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Purifoy.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison, and thank you all for being here. I know it's an awkward time, so I appreciate you making time today. So I'm going to read, just set a timer that I'm not moving over. I'm going to read an excerpt from a forthcoming essay in the journal Cultural Dynamics, which explores something that I'm working through, the Black Afterlife or Lives of the Forest. And the essay itself explores 3 scenes from the mid-19th to the late 20th century to kind of trace the racial and social-cultural transformation of forest landscapes in the United States. And afterwards, Dr. Morrison and I will kind of talk more about sort of the context for this, and you can ask any sort of questions that you'd like. Okay, I'm gonna hop right in. Scene 1, a Negro funeral, 1859. In 1859, Harper's Monthly published an article about life on rice plantations in the South entitled The Rice Lands of the South. The plantations were located in the region that the author calls Carolina, though the 2 states, North Carolina and South Carolina, had by then been partitioned for over a century. The author of the article, T. Addison Richards, was an illustrator and travel writer who was born in London, UK, but raised in Georgia and South Carolina, and spent most of his career writing and illustrating mostly about US landscapes and the societies that developed in and around them. The tenor of this particular essay is mostly curious and amused at the lifestyles of the plantation, the aesthetics of the planter class and their aspirations, the sights and sounds of the landscape. The reader learns nothing of Richard's own Southern upbringing, much less his connections to the Carolinas, making him appear more like a detached observer. Nevertheless, inasmuch as Richard's words convey the kind of voyeuristic disdain common among white observers of Black life, particularly those posturing as Northerners, the illustrations included throughout the article demand a different story than his own interpretation. Indeed, the images frequently offered many more insights into Black life than the words that might accompany them. This could even be true in instances where the author's intent was caricature. What Black people did in those scenes, and importantly, where they were while doing it, created a possibility for the subjects of those scenes to communicate to future witnesses, particularly Black witnesses, about their lives in ways that are rarely explicitly available in words or official documents authored by them in the archive. In this way, white illustrators like Richards could create a visual archive of Black life that reveals far more than intended, and certainly far beyond the author's own interpretation. In most of Richard's scenes from the Carolina rice plantation, even when Black people are placed as central subjects of the image, their posture indicates how they inhabit the space. On the plantation, they are upright, seen here, and their choreography is mechanical. The landscape and conditions do not create space for rest or a break in their form. They are exposed to the elements, to the sight lines of the overseer, and they are working against the temporal and pacing demands of the planter, which might be reinforced with violence. The Negro funeral, pictured here, presents a dramatic shift in the imagery, different than every other illustration that's in the article, in its affect and even in its visual clarity. Whereas the sight lines of the planter's life are open and far-reaching, evidence of land clearance and domination of the environment by the planter class, the Black life portrayed in this image is obscured, not just because of the literal darkness of the nighttime scene, but also, I argue, because as Richards describes the scene, he is both stirred and alienated by what he sees. His attempts at plain explanation are thwarted by his own emotional response, simultaneously frightened and intrigued. And I'm going to sort of quote this sort of passage from him about this image. The statement of excitement and exaltation to which their impressionable natures are so easily wrought, especially in religious matters, is manifest in their singing even more strangely than in their preaching and praying. Not seldom has it been our pleasure to listen to impromptu music, wondrously sweet and wild and weird, which, well counterfeited on the lyric stage, would bring fame and fortune. Perhaps the most remarkable of these exhibitions are those which are wont to occur on occasions of funeral solemnities, celebrated as they are, in the deep night darkness of some dense old wood, made doubly dismal by the ghostly light of the pine torches and the phantom-like figures of the scarcely visible mourners, end quote. Because the Negro funeral is created in the Tondo style of illustration, which means in the round, the deep, dark, and dismal woods are literally encircling the mourners, covering them, insulating them with their foliage in the fashion of a harbor. The ghostly light of the pine torches is illustrated as a kind of glow illuminating both trees and mourners, again providing a kind of cover for the barely visible mourners, a demarcation of a sacred landscape. The phantom-like figures are an interesting interpretation of the mourners because in spiritual traditions formed during slavery, death was when the spirit was able to take a flight to freedom, per Michelle Commander's book, Afro-Atlantic Flight. The metaphoric phantom, which evokes terror for the author and the planter class, could also be interpreted as symbolic of spirits flying home, finally free. The choreography and posture of this scene without text might be interpreted completely out of its temporal and social political context. It is a scene occurring within the context of subjection and under the gaze of oppression, but its meaning extends beyond subjugation. The kneeling postures, the expressions of grief, the taking in of the landscape without being bound to it creates an alternative sense of spatiality, where affect, not labor, is at the center. Here, there is no clearing, no road, no prescribed order. It is the forest, and in the forest, there is something akin to freedom, or at least a break from slavery, a hiatus from the specific brutalizing context. In this context, the scene is also one of improvisation and experimentation with new ways of being, of becoming Black. The scene gestures to what Sharp calls the necessity for changeability and improvisation under the quote unquote weather of anti-Blackness. We find in this ritual the formative seeds of what becomes the Black church, carved out of grief, trauma, oppression, and the desire to live, to continue. That desire creates an opportunity, indeed an imperative, for enslaved Africans to turn toward each other for strategies for defining their own freedom, for collectively inventing practices and conceptualizations and experiments in freedom. 4 months after Richards' publication in Harper's Monthly, abolitionist John Brown executed his now famous raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown and 19 men sought to seize weapons from the armory, putting them into the hands of enslaved people in nearby locations. The ultimate goal was to incite a slave insurrection and to escape to the forests of the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains, where they would establish free communities and build another pathway of the Underground Railroad. According to historian Fergus Bordewich, Brown's raid and insurrectionary plan hastened the secession of the Confederate States from the United States. Harper's Weekly, a separate magazine with the same publishers as Harper's Monthly, published front page coverage of this raid, calling Brown a quote unquote half-crazed white, whose views and aims were, to say the least, extremely vague and indefinite. Scene 2, Their Little Church in the Woods, 1831. 2 years after Harper's Monthly published Richard's travelogue featuring a Negro funeral, Harriet Jacobs, then writing under the pseudonym Linda Brent, self-published Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the autobiographical account of her life in and escape from slavery. A major significance of Incidents is that it is authored by the person who was enslaved instead of through a proxy or detached account of slavery by a white person, as demonstrated with Richard's piece in Harper's Monthly. The mid-19th century was a critical juncture for enslaved people's literature to describe their experiences in their own words and to galvanize support for slavery's eventual abolition. Like the people illustrated in A Negro Funeral, Jacobs resided in the Carolinas, specifically Edenton, North Carolina, and the state's coastal plain. She escaped slavery in 1835 and famously hid for 7 years in the garret of her grandmother's home, convincing her enslaver thereby that she had escaped north. When she was finally able to leave the state, she landed in Massachusetts, where during John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, she wrote about her admiration for him in her autobiography, which was published 2 years later, and ultimately without that chapter on the raid, at the suggestion of one of her white editors, Lydia Child. Jacob's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl corroborates the significance of the Negro funeral. In chapter 12, Fear of Insurrection, Jacobs recounts the news spreading of Nat Turner's 1831 slave rebellion in neighboring Virginia, and how it incited fear and panic within the planter class, as well as for the enslaved who feared the violence that always derived from the planter's fear. Jacob quips, quote, "Strange that they should be alarmed when their slaves were so, quote unquote, contented and happy, but so it was." In this chapter, and these are images, obviously not from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but those that I sort of curated from an archive at the Schomburg Center that I think are kind of reflective of the time period and the kind of scenes that are being described. In this chapter, we arrive at the forest scene through acts of violence and attempts by the enslaved to preserve the places and practices that they had developed prior to the insurrection. Turner's rebellion triggered an already annual practice on the plantation called the muster. In this practice, the planters would join up with the lower class non-slaveholding white people to form a militia in which the planters served as the commanders and the lower class whites made up the rank and file soldiers. They dressed in military uniform and marched to martial music as they performed systematic raids and seizures on the homes of the enslaved. And this is a quote from Jacobs. "It was a grand opportunity for the low whites, who had no Negroes of their own to scourge. They exulted in such a chance to exercise a little brief authority and show their subserviency to the slaveholders, not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people also kept them in poverty, ignorance, and moral degradation. Unquote. The muster scene not only demonstrates the race and class power dynamics of the plantation society, but also transcribes the geographies of planter life, the summoning or muster of lower class white people from the neighboring towns, the spatiality of the slave quarters away from the planter's home, the threat that could spill over to the planters if the soldiers' lust for violence and theft got out of hand. The planters thus had jurisdiction over the plantation and the town, which were heavily interdependent geographies, both for economic reasons and because of the collective upholding of the racial social structure. But the forest or the woods had a different orientation. Though the planters asserted control over the landscape, it had a different meaning for them, and that it existed outside of the quote unquote civilized society that they were trying to build. If anything, it was a fungible resource when needed for hunting, timber, etc., and it was a place that might be conquered for future settlement or civilization. However, as demonstrated by Richards, it was also a fearful place for them. It was wild and dangerous and at times deemed a wasteland, particularly when located within a swamp or valley or other space that was thought to harbor diseases or deadly beasts. Because of its tenuous relationship with the planters, the forest became a geography of possibility for enslaved peoples, and of course, not just them, but also indigenous peoples, fugitives, and other quote unquote undesirables. It is on the margins of the plantation's architecture, which provides clearance for the planter in multiple ways: clearance from the friction of the woods, the swamps, and the wildlife that inhabit them, clearance of sight lines for surveillance and control, clearance ostensibly from people, indigenous or otherwise, who for the most part have better knowledge of the landscapes which threaten the planter's geographic vision, which becomes ultimately what George Lipsitz calls the white spatial imaginary. The forest then represents a kind of liminal space, not free, but not yet the clearings or the plantation, where experiments in freedom, large or small, can recur. We see these experiments in two brief moments that make up this second forest scene. First, during the muster, Jacobs recounts that as conditions became more violent at nighttime, the often drunk poor whites formed into patrol bands and went wherever they chose among the colored people, acting out their brutal will. Many women hid themselves in woods and swamps to keep out of their way. I notice here the contrast between the forest as a space of safety, a pathway out of danger for Black women during the muster, and the forest as described as the dismal and dense woods as described by Richards in 1859. This is not to suggest that the forest could not be a fearful place, right, for enslaved or free Black people, but that the landscapes of the forest and plantation had critical differences in interpretation. Indeed, Tiffany Lathabo King's analysis in the Black Shoals, offshore formations of Black and Native studies, underscores the quote unquote fidgeting geographies of South Carolina and Georgia and William Gerard de Brom's 1757 map, and the incompleteness of conquest as represented in the settler cartography of the region. I'm so sorry, I don't have an image of this, but just describing that there are regions on these maps that are kind of demarcated as no-go zones, right? And it's representative of the ways that the presence and movement of Black and Native peoples in forests or the swamps functioned as spatial instability, thus inciting white fear and further violences. The second moment in an incident in this one chapter comes in the aftermath of the muster, after the same lower class whites murdered, raped, and pillaged both free and enslaved Black people who had no connection, as it turned out, with Nat Turner of the rebellion. Jacobs describes how the enslaved peoples, quote, begged the privilege of again meeting at their little church in the woods with their burying ground around it, end quote. After the Turner insurrection, the planters, having banned all visitations of enslaved peoples among plantations, interpreted the little Black church in the woods as a threat rather than a reinstantiation of their own white Christian doctrine. They denied the request and the church was demolished. We can observe in the violences of these two moments the simultaneous fear of the planter class and the rage of the low whites, and how the forest can represent a refuge from both. While the clearances of the plantation represent both control for the planters and aspiration for the low whites, the forest is a threat to both, as both are trying to overcome the wilderness via domination. The planters are trying to permanently defeat it, and the low whites are trying to keep themselves from slipping back into it, as their whiteness and thus their status as civilized is the only thing separating them from the loathsome, presumed wild and savage enslaved. Political philosopher Charles Mills refers to this exit from the state of nature, which must attend the formation of the white civilized subject. Meanwhile, the forest as the white avoidant landscape is where another kind or type of spatial imaginary could and did develop. The little church in the woods offered something wholly different from the religious instruction of the planters determined the enslaved needed to keep them from murdering their masters, as Jacobs makes clear in the chapter following the muster. In particular, she focuses on the hymns created and sung by the enslaved with lyrics that were nonsensical to white Christian logics. And yet, Jacobs describes the enslaved as having no higher happiness than to meet at the church in the woods and sing hymns together and pour out their hearts in spontaneous prayer. Though she offers a little additional detail about the goings-on at the church in the woods, she repeats a verse from one of the hymns sung to the confoundment and anger of the planters. Old Satan's church is here below. Up to God's free church I hope to go. Cry amen, cry amen, cry amen to God. In his essay, Slave Spirituals and the Southern Environment, Damon Parker describes how the church hymnody creates a sense of community for the enslaved, as quote, white communities already had a family, town, state, and country, end quote. Parker too notices the centrality of the landscape, forest, swamp, wood, valley, to the development of the Black Spiritual Songbook, Black Spiritual Songbooks, where the wilderness is cast as a place to find God rather than where to descend into evil and sin, as often reflected in white cultural and religious norms of the time, and particularly through white Christianity. Indeed, these points of intersection in histories point to not only to the forest as a landscape of refuge and experimentation with other non-plantation modes of spirituality and practice, but also to its centrality in the very formation of cognizable Black cultural traditions out of the plurality of African religions, languages, and cultures intersecting in the United States. Scene 3, The Dark White Forest, 1978. A year before Richard's article, and as Jacobs was still looking for a publisher for Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, future US President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was born in Manhattan. I focus on his birth because in many ways, the first two scenes provide context for his upbringing, the insurrectionary climate on the eve of the US Civil War, and the drastically changed landscape of the postbellum United States. By the time Roosevelt established the US Forest Service in 1905, the forest had taken on new character and significance. The end of the US Civil War and the legal emancipation of millions of enslaved Black people meant not only the reunification of the country, but also the completion of the enclosure of the land, including the evisceration of what I might call the insurrectionary forest. For as much as ending slavery was about changing the status of Black people to from property object to worker subject, it was also about quashing the alternative possibilities for place in society that threatened the US national project. These threats included including those emerging from within maroon communities hidden in forests and swamplands, and from various forms of refuge and resistance practiced by those who used the forest as a temporary escape from slavery. Those fidgeting contingent geographies of the forest thus represented much more than mere refuge from the planter class and white violence. They were places of radical reimagining of the places that had become the United States. They were another possibility for decolonization and dismantling the state project, or at the very least, fracturing the total conquest of the nation through the coexistence of numerous alternative societies. Sylviane Diouf distinguishes the aspirations of Miranage from abolition, whereas the latter was more aimed at altering the legal status of enslaved peoples to become citizens of the United States. The former often rejected the national project, favoring an entirely different vision of society. When abolition ultimately prevailed, the national project won not just reunification, but also the dominant spatial imaginary, in which all land was some form of property, and all fruits of the earth were for commodification and extraction. Melody Staria Mobley is the first Black woman to serve, was the first Black woman to serve in the U.S. Forest Service, which she joined in 1977 at 19 years old. Originally from Kentucky, Mobley spent much of her youth in the forested parks outside of Louisville, where her mother instilled in her a love of and deep relationship with forests. When she joined the U.S. Forest Service, there had been a sweep of federal affirmative action policies, executive orders, and legislation aimed at ending employment discrimination, particularly for federal employers and large employers receiving federal funding. Mobley characterized her acceptance to the U.S. Forest Service as an opportunity to fulfill her dreams of becoming a ranger or a biologist. She began her fellowship with the Forest Service after her first year of college at the University of Washington, which is intended to become a permanent position after she attained a forestry degree. In contrast to her experiences in the Kentucky woods growing up, Mobley said that she never felt free in the forest managed by the U.S. Forest Service. She describes a scene in the summer of 1978 when she was raped by one of her white male colleagues at the U.S. Forest Service bunker in Skyamish, Washington, in the presence of a white female officer. The Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, the ancestral lands of at least 7 Native nations before their expulsion and the establishment of federal jurisdiction over the landscape by the Forest Service, became one of many forest landscapes across the U.S. that for Mobley represented terror, shame, and despair. While many white women eventually filed lawsuits about persistent sexual harassment and assault while serving as officers in the U.S. Forest Service, Mobley emphasizes the specific violence of misogynoir, reflecting her intersectional existence as a Black woman in the forest, which posed a specific threat to the overwhelmingly white male U.S. Forest Service and their continued domination over these landscapes that were deeply contested just a century before. Recall the scene in the muster and incidents when the enslaved women took refuge in the woods and swamps to avoid rape and other forms of violence from the white patrols. Mobley's rape scene demonstrates both the diminishment of that refuge and the ongoing defense of white conquest within that landscape. The Forest Reserve Act of 1891 gave the President of the U.S. authority to set apart and reserve public land bearing forests as public reservations. The federal law was in response to the devastating clearance of much of the forest across the new nation for the purposes of industry and building wealth. Within that earlier 19th century context, forests were endangered, but there were still areas stewarded by Native peoples who had not been expelled from the land, and by Maroons and enslaved peoples who found refuge, community, and practiced an array of social, political, and spiritual traditions in that space. I'm gonna skip ahead here, just in the interest of time. Teddy Roosevelt's U.S. service was in many ways the antithesis of the forced relations observed via Black and Indigenous peoples in the colonial and antebellum eras. He became known as the nation's first conservation president. In Roosevelt's imagination, the forest was a space for rehearsing conquest, whether through big game hunting or through managing the wilderness, which had to be uninhabited by people, and particularly non-white people, in order to be manageable. Environmental sociologist Dorsita Taylor emphasizes how, in the United States imagination, the wilderness transformed from a, quote, savage, barren, desolate wasteland, end quote, to a space essential for nation building. She says, wildlands were thought to develop in people characteristics essential for nation and state building. They helped citizens to understand that civility and order was necessary in society. They fostered self-reliance, a strenuous lifestyle, and civic pride. Taylor describes Roosevelt's frontierist approach to the forest as a means of asserting, quote unquote, vigorous manliness through conquest of wildlife, often stuffing them for trophies, and as a means to avoid what Roosevelt called the over-civilized man who has lost the great fighting, masterful virtues. Okay, almost done here. This profound shift in the significance of the forest as an American public good in which public was synonymous with whiteness and manliness, coincided with a new era for Black people. By the turn of the 20th century, the reunified nation reconstructed the forest from a refuge and space of otherworldly experimentation to a place of terror. As lynchings became a commonplace exercise for reinforcing racial order and disciplining Blackness. Anti-foraging laws both deepened the restrictions of property and all but eroded the commons and traditional knowledges and methods of living with the land, which included harvesting wild foods and medicines and contributing to their regeneration. After nearly 4 decades of enduring violence and isolation in the U.S. Forest Service, Mobley was forced to retire in 2005. She was pushed out of her position for being vocal about the various physical abuses and harassment that she endured, and for filing a legal complaint against the agency. Her devastating experiences and ultimate exit were as much about the shift in the socio-legal structure and significance of the forest as it was about the people who abused her. In the final scene of the documentary called The Dark White Forest, Mobley is walking through the woods of Arlington, Virginia, with several mostly Black young people trailing her. She shows them how to navigate the landscape and teaches them about the various forms of life living in the woods, even those like the snake here that might inspire fear or anxiety. As the documentary ends, she is adamant that she will reclaim the forest for people who look like her by spending her remaining life bringing as many generations as possible into a relationship of familiarity and solidarity with the landscape. And I will stop here. Thank you for listening. Just have this book here by Clyde Woods, to reflect on the sort of continuities across time and space in relationship to the forest.
Okay, join me first in thanking Dr. Purifoy for sharing such an illuminating talk. Going to move over here so that we can have a little bit of a discussion before we open it up for Q&A. It's okay. You want to take this list? You had to slide a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so thanks again for sharing it. I know previously when we talked about this, you were saying that something new that you're working through, and I appreciate like all of the scene setting and quite literally analysis of the scenes. And I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit on how you arrived to this kind of archive of scenes and kind of the line of inquiry.
Thank you. It was really kind of wayward. I normally start this presentation with that context. So basically, very briefly, the US South is a site, and particularly the forests that are still in existence in the region, which you may not know is considered the nation's wood basket. So much timber logging, right? Wood based projects actually come from the US South and are exported across the world. And one of the newer wood products that is being exported, produced and exported right now is wood pellets, a woody biomass that's actually being exported to the UK and Europe as part of their climate adaptation goals. They are wanting to substitute wood pellet, coal. They're wanting to substitute coal with wood pellets, which, if you know anything about the difference between coal and wood, is an absurdity, right? It takes far, far, far more wood to kind of even equate the kind of unit of energy that coal represents. So there's this, right now, this sort of mass deforestation, over 1 million acres in the last like 10, 15 years of the US South to meet the UK and Europe's climate change goals. And the way that I got from there to here was I was actually I was doing a piece of journalism about about the environmental justice impacts of the mills that are creating these wood pellets, which are mostly in Black rural communities, in the South and particularly in North Carolina. And the focus was really so much more on that I was asked to focus on. It was really about the industrial impacts and not what the actual forest and the sort of deforestation meant to the local communities. And that really took me down this sort of rabbit hole of like, why are we separating these issues, right? Why is it that the Dogwood Alliance and sort of these big white green organizations, feel like their appropriate arena is like protecting the forest, and when we talk about Black communities' relationship to this industry, it's really only about the mill and the pollution that it produces and the health impacts. So that sort of led me to this, really thinking about what are the histories of Black folks in forest landscapes. I had started reading a bit about marronage in that time, but very quickly at the Schomburg Center in New York, even just a cursory search, right, of like Black and forest, like really this like massive visual archive, right, of Black folks, mostly in like, not mostly, but like many of the images of funerals, religious services, sort of spiritual traditions being taking place in those spaces, as well as like this sort of interplay, right, with the planter class, or what Harriet Jacobs called the low whites and the muster, right, in those landscapes. So that's really the kind of context and how I came to it.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That makes me think of a couple of things. One, thinking about Toni Morrison's Beloved and like the clearing, right?
Yeah.
But also, which kind of goes into my next question too. Thinking about particularly, I've been thinking a lot recently about the kind of tensions or relationships between like ownership and stewardship, particularly as it relates to land. And your example are kind of bringing up, kind of the U.S. timber industry made me think of kind of like personally, my great grandmother had, her and her sisters had inherited some family land in Virginia that over the years they kept talking about how timber companies were very interested in buying that land. And before she passed away, I think kind of passed the land on to my grandfather, who then I think essentially like him and whoever the other family members were sold it. And so that brought up a lot of feelings for me personally as we think about kind of Black land ownership, Black land possession. But toward the question, I think as we understand increasingly, and I think in academic context, about kind of property ownership within kind of Western colonial project of enclosure. From your perspective or in your research inquiry so far, what, if any, do you see are the restorative possibilities within the domain of like Black land or property ownership?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and it's come up quite a bit as I've sort of gone down the rabbit hole on this topic. There's actually in my department at UNC a scholar named Dr. Shorna Allred, who does quite a bit of research on Black forest landowners, and trying to kind of create a network of these forest landowners to kind of figure out strategies for maintaining, right, maintaining the land and sort of not, right, selling off to timber industries. Both for, there's climate money in that, right, of course, but also, I've been thinking more about these histories and these kind of traditions of Black forest histories and connections to these landscapes. So, one of the things I know is that, the way that the USDA and the US Forest Service, right, have kind of structured funding, right, around forest conservation is really geared towards holders who have a lot more land than most Black forest landowners have, right? And two, the USDA really prioritizes giving funding to big timber plantation owners, right? Essentially. And so even if you wanted to get money to do something else with that land, like do recreation, right? Do like that kind of stewardship, you're really hard pressed with size constraints and also like types of funding constraints to get that kind of access. So I know that those are really big barriers. But I want to say that, there's, I did a kind of a literature review of Black forest landowners a couple of years ago. And one of the things that was really striking to me was that there are a ton left, right? It's not nearly as much as there were a century ago, right? But a ton left, and an orientation, right, an approach to the land that is unsurprisingly quite different, right, than sort of the dominant ethos that is reflected in like the regulatory and funding agencies that do things around forests, right? There's more desirability to, right, like maintain the forest landscape, right, to do, if you're doing timber harvest, to, right, like do them on a kind of as needed basis and not as the like central enterprise of the landscape. And a real overwhelming desire to be able to do other things, right? To get resources to be able to do other things on that land besides harvesting timber, right? And besides, right, like making the trees themselves the core commodity. So yeah, that's been my kind of, I've only started this in 2020, but that's been my kind of limited understanding of like what's going on there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think thinking about other types of land, like forested land, I think also opens up a different opportunity for conversations around what can sometimes be, to me, an oversimplified tension between like people should own nothing, with the kind of very real histories of kind of Black dispossession of land, the need for kind of protected space for Black community, Black recreation, right? And so I'm gonna follow up with you for the colleague that you mentioned to learn a little bit more about that. Thinking about some of the scenes that you shared, I couldn't help but think about the Dunbar Notes exhibit that either recently closed or is still there. Thinking particularly about the Landis Archive and the Landis Witness. And one of the things I appreciated in that exhibition was there was a particular like kind of placard, and it was talking about thinking about the trees as witness. And it's something I've thought about a lot, like over the years when I see like really old trees. I grew up in Southern Virginia, and just thinking about, how much has this tree seen? And so, I'm just curious about, and you begin to talk about this a little bit, but what we might learn from a perspective of kind of what the land has witnessed, and maybe if you see that coming up in your work.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at is precisely that relationship, right? That I think there's a way that to tell the story about a landscape is to tell the story about a backdrop, right? Like something that just happened in a place and it's scenic, it might be pretty, but it doesn't have any kind of agency or deep relation, or certainly not intimacy with the people who are actually existing within this space. And I think the Black ecologies, frameworks that are being developed by folks like J.T. Bone, Justin Hoseby, Tiana Williams right now, are really helping us to get more at that intimacy by taking closer and more like in-depth looks at how Black folks interacted with their environments on and off the plantation, right? And I think, you know, the framing, right? Like, you know, when I get to the end of this, you know, this final scene, like the forest is this, you know, space of wonder slash terror, right? And a lot of it is terror, right, for Black folks, as it is sort of framed in a kind of dominant imaginary, right? But I think that, you know, based on these histories, I'm like, gosh, like, you know, not even 200 years ago, that was quite different, right? It wasn't that it wasn't, you know, couldn't be a space of terror, right? But imagining building a church in the middle of the woods, right? Imagining hosting your most sacred, you know, spiritual traditions and practices in the dense forests, right? And so those trees not only witnessed, right, what was happening, right, they were really integral to what was happening. They made what happened possible. And, you know, someone actually learned recently, as I was doing this research, that the church that I grew up in, St. Joseph's A&E Church in Durham, North Carolina, in historic Hayti, which is a, you know, post-bellum Black settlement on the outskirts of Durham that was ultimately, right, annexed into the city and then half destroyed by a highway. But as one of the anchor churches there, right, you know, and it's a very kind of, you know, I just want to say, like, just be clear, like, it's a very kind of middle class, like, bougie, right, like, kind of like church that, you know, when we had Girl Scouts, like, we didn't camp out, right, like in the church, like we would have sleepovers in the church, you know what I mean? But I found out that the origins of that church were in a brush arbor, right? Outdoors, an outdoor church. And it's fascinating to kind of think about, right, that particular origin point for this church that feels so far removed, right, from that kind of relation now. So yeah, I think I'm really interested, right, in like bring the trees back, right? Like let's have more of a discussion about our relationship to these trees. You know, that doesn't you know, we can talk about things like lynchings. We can absolutely talk about the terror, right? But I think it's hard to understand actually the terror, the context of that terror without understanding everything that kind of came before enduring, right? Like that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. And it makes me think about, as you kind of talked about the kind of origins of the church versus kind of where it was in terms of you growing up, thinking about, which is something I'm thinking about toward my next project, the ways that, you know, Black relationships to land, particularly in the South and with the Great Migration, just was kind of fractured in many ways, and not just kind of geographical proximity and actual ownership, but also the idea of kind of like a mental or psychological or emotional stigma of kind of being proximal to land. And so I think about the kind of like what it means to kind of get more, to come up, right, to kind of gain access to different kind of outward manifestations of achievement or wealth that might look like a church that's no longer, you know, in the woods or among the trees, but how sometimes that is an overcorrection, right? And has kind of placed us in a space that's a little bit more divorced from what might be restorative in terms of ecologies. So I want to open it up for Q&A from our audience. We are, just in case people need a time check, we are at 2:00. We do have some time for questions, but I just want to make sure we know where we are in case anyone needs to run. So questions to start?
Thank you.
Yeah, you can
Okay,
project.
okay, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. And like as usual with you, you open like a world, so many questions, so many possible avenues, so many personal experiences with nature in this case. So thank you so much for like opening those multiple doors for us. My question is more about the place of water in this case. I just because I was thinking in my dad's relationship, like growing up, his best memories were like swimming with his siblings. You know, it was like this space for freedom, you know, his space for freedom in that moment. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about.
Yeah, water is, I think I mean, fresh water and also, right, the ocean, right, like are such core subjects of Black ecologies and Black ecological, right, like knowledges. I think that there's been not so much, but like a good amount, right, of scholarship on, you know, like our relationship to the Atlantic, right, to oceans, right.
Can I be a little bit more intentional?
Yes, yes.
Can I center more in the rivers in the forest?
Rivers in the forest, yeah. Yeah, well, what I was gonna say is that, like, I think that there's been a lot on the oceans, but actually not as much on the freshwater, right? I mean, I think there's starting to be a little bit, right? But I think, again, in, this visual archive that I feel like I've just scratched the surface of at the Schomburg, right? I know there are so many river baptisms, right? There's so much, right, of like the sort of Black spiritual practices that are happening in freshwater bodies, as well as people in and around, right, freshwater landscapes that, occur often, right, like through forested landscapes because they have deep relation, right? So yes, I think in future work, as I'm sort of trying to expand on this, I think there's the ecology of it is incomplete, right? Like there's so much more, right, to kind of get into. And this piece is just like, wow, it was like, here are all these images, and I could write forever about like each one of these scenes and understanding them in context. But absolutely, like I think that the water is essential, right, to this story. I just didn't get to it in this essay, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hey, Danielle.
Hey.
So I was really intrigued by the conversation around hauntings and the spirituality of the forest. And I was thinking about like how you framed forest landscapes, not just as backdrop, but also as agent. So I wondered if you could kind of tie that all together and speak a little bit more about the forest agency in these kind of spiritual processes. Like what things does the forest offer that is bolstering that within the Black community? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I am still like, I feel like I'm still working through that piece. I think I had gotten as far as being like, as far as kind of that quote by Clyde Woods, that's really tying it pre slave trade, pre-colonial, right? Like African, several, right? Like African spiritual traditions in the forest to what happens, right, in in the quote unquote new world, right? Like, so not just limited to the United States, but across the West. And I think one of the things that it kind of gets me to is these questions around, one of the things is questions around Afro-Indigenous practices, right? Because there's and this person, Akin Agundaran, who is a senior fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, but is a Nigerian historian. And one of the things that, and he writes about a lot of this work is around the West African rainforest belt, which is where a lot of people who were trafficked, right, during the transatlantic slave trade came from across multiple, right, countries, or what are now countries anyway. And, you know, one of the things that just in conversation with him, and I haven't, he's been like sending me like literature to kind of look at, is like, he was just like, oh, I told him about this project. He was like, oh, yes, this is very obvious. And he was like, trees in my tradition were people, right? Like they had spirit and animacy, right? In a particular way that we aren't structuring trees around here. And he was like, you know, the people who were trafficked would have had those particular ontologies, right? And epistemic traditions around what a forest was and what trees were, right? When they landed here. And that would have shaped, right? Like their relationship. And I think in particular, the fact that Marinage starts immediately, right? You know, upon African arrival, right? Through the trade here, and into the woods, right? And into the forest landscapes and the swamp landscapes. So there's a kind of like history here that's like, I think, being carried over. And then there's the question of what it kind of means in the context of like all of these, right, African peoples from different places coming together and creating this thing that we call Blackness, right, and Black cultural traditions. And that's kind of where I'm wanting to kind of chase down, like, okay, so like, what do trees mean now, right? Like, how do we get, from there to here? And are there bits and pieces in like Afro-religious traditions that are kind of morphing and developing, right, as Blackness is morphing and developing, that give us more insight into continuities and divergences in those understandings? Yeah, all that to say, beautiful question. And I feel like I'm just at the beginning of like, oh, like, what's the agency? What's the, yeah.
Thank you again for your words. So you mentioned something in the beginning with the opening scenes, going off of that point where you said the church in the woods offered something wholly different. And I don't know if maybe just I thought of like the play on the words, if you're thinking of like wholly like completely and fully different, as well as I think when you read it, I didn't get that assumption, but I'm wondering to that previous question if you could maybe say more about it being like something spiritually different as well. The church in the woods offering something spiritually different as well as what you talked about like just comprehensively. And then secondly, didn't know some of the fun facts about Teddy Roosevelt, and you mentioned like the Badlands. I couldn't help as an organizer thinking of like Cop City, right, where they are utilizing, where you mentioned preparing for conquest. So using space and forest to continually perpetuate this idea of I need to see something, capture something, because there's these people in it that we need to what happened. Yeah. So I think of that now with not just in Atlanta and as it being a huge example, but also this organizations up here in DC talking about like private equity firms, the displacement of communities, right, that are otherwise termed like in the news and the media of bad folk or crazy youth running around the metro station that we need to hide from. You know what I mean? Like just that type of language being played out. So maybe I think that's the question I could ask you. It's like the language.
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank y'all. These are beautiful questions. So the church in the woods, one of the things that I'm really trying to grapple with is this distinction, the line between, in these scenes, really the plantation and the forest, right? A plantation is like in so many ways like antithetical to what a forest is, right? And in fact, there's in forestry scholarship, as I'm learning, there's a thing that they call a plantation forest, which is like the like most asinine thing I've ever heard of, but it's the idea that you could build, you could create a kind of densely wooded area of just a singular tree species, right? And mostly those are for economic production for timber. right? But like nothing could be different, right? Be more different than something that is singular tree species that requires all sorts of chemical inputs and amendments to soil, right, to kind of maintain, right, versus a forest, which is not a space without human intervention, actually requires human intervention to sustain itself. Otherwise, you see what happens in California, you know, there's all sorts of tinder on the ground, and whenever there's a fire during the dry season, it's up in flames. So, you know, but the kind of, and sometimes I hate the use of this word because it's overused, but the biodiversity, right, of that kind of space is a very different kind of space. And I think that the specific, when I call it the specific brutalizing context of the plantation, of having total exposure to the elements, right? Having the kind of, and that, you know, it's all leveled because you want that sight line and you want to be able to monitor into time. Like they're literally on a different kind of time scale, right? On the plantation that you would be in the forest. And so is the land, right? The land is, the soils on plantations are exhausted, right? By monocrop, right? Production that is supposed to happen like this. And in the forest, like if you're on forest time, like we're talking centuries, right? Like, you know, the trees that you see in a like a genuine kind of forest or woodland, right, that has enough coverage and canopy, right, took centuries, right, to create and you know, and there are other time scales that are happening, right, like cyclically and seasonally and all of those sorts of things. So the bottom line is that like I think that there's like it's almost like entering into another world, right? When you escape out of that space. And what's wild is to actually think about it as being like aligned, right? Like you cross into that kind of space and all of a sudden, like the actual land is existing in a different kind of time scale, not unrelated, right? Because the plantation definitely has impacts on the forest, on the, you know, forest landscape and what's possible there, but it's a different kind of space. And I think, right, like enslaved people are, you know, they're stealing their time, right? Like quite literally in that space. And they're able, hopefully, I think, right, to slow down and to have a different kind of orientation to space and relation to each other. And, you know, and an ability to kind of practice things that might feel a lot different, right? Even if they do happen on the plantation. But perhaps more difficult, right, in that space. So yeah, I'm really grappling kind of with that kind of thing. And I think, you know, holy might be, right, right, like a word for that. Thank you for bringing up Cop City. I think I thought a lot about this while, you know, doing this project, because the whole movement around Cop City has been happening the entire time I've been writing this, or thinking in this arena. And I think you're right to bring the parallel to Roosevelt's kind of conquest of the West, right, as a Rough Rider, right? Like he's literally engaged in the practice of clearing indigenous peoples off those lands of the West in order to then come back and become president and create national parks and forests, national forests out of those same spaces. It's a real stunning, right? Like kind of thing, you know, and he's not, you know, when he goes off into the wilderness, I have to say, he had just lost when he first goes off into the wilderness on this, you know, becomes a Rough Rider and everything. He's grieving actually. He lost his wife and his mother in the same day in his house. They both died, one in childbirth, and then his mother was ill. And he leaves his, you know, his firstborn child with his sister, and then goes off in the woods to kill everything. Like quite literally. Like I was just like, this man just left his child and then he went in the woods and then he like started big game hunting, right? And like, you know, is getting out whatever, right? You know, through that kind of process and, you know, falls in love, right? Like with these landscapes, and it makes him feel manly. Like there's all of this like self-aggrandizement that's happening through this process. and then becomes, right, part of this, like, you know, conquest. And I think it's just an interesting biographical tidbit. I'm just like, the grief that you see in like the Negro funeral and like these other things is like, you know, a deeply kind of like, we're relating to each other in our grief, and we're building a spiritual tradition around, right, like around death. And then this man just is like, kill all the things, right? So yeah, I think that there's a very apt parallel, right, with what's happening in Cop City right now, kind of like, oh, this is the new frontier that needs to be cleared for the next phase of our conquest and increased militarization of our police forces. Yeah.
I wasn't here at the beginning, I was class, sorry. So I don't know if you've addressed this, but I'm wondering about the role that ancestry plays in connection to the land. I'm Haitian, and one of the things that keeps me up at night is not being able to go. But I've heard from like other people my age about having kind of like spiritual ancestral experiences on the land that their ancestors were enslaved on. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how how ancestry plays a role in your work.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that it was kind of this part of the start of this process, right? These communities, actually, I know one of the people who lives near the wood pellet mills that I was talking about earlier. Were you here for that part? I can't remember. Okay, so no, it's okay. It was just the beginning of the Q&A, and I was just talking about how the origin story of this project is these wood pellet mills that are leveling a lot of southern forests in the United States for climate adaptation goals in the UK and Europe. They're located in a lot of Black rural communities in the South. And they're not just milling the wood there, they're sourcing the wood, right? Also from the neighboring kind of forest areas. And these lands, right, like, you know, when I spoke to Miss Belinda Joyner, who's one of the people that I know who lives near an in vivo wood pellet mill, you know, she's like, our family has been here for 100 years, right? Like these are our ancestral lands that are being trounced upon, right? For, you know, through environmental racism, right? You know, to level these forests and also to produce these wood pellets. And really, like, you know, the atmospheric experience, honestly, right? Of being near one of these mills is that it is 24/7 sawdust, right? People have to wash their cars and power wash their homes regularly because like the dust from these trees being ground into wood pellets is like literally just in the air all the time. It goes 24/7. So there's a desecration that's happening, right, in these ancestral spaces, and the fight, right, to protect, you know, the sovereignty or the integrity, right, of these spaces to keep them livable, right, is kind of the genesis of this project for me, right. And what I'm interested in is like not just the kind of like this is the family home place, right? But also like the ecosystems, right, that exist around it, including these forests. So I think so much of this is all about ancestry and all about a kind of reclamation and a maintenance of a relationship to not just to land as a kind of generic thing, right? But to the kind of full like ecosystems in which, right, these folks are living. So I hope that answers your question. That's sort of the starting place. I love that. And I think that also the spiritual traditions that I was alluding to in the talk, you know, the churches in the woods, right, the brush arbors, those kinds of traditions are also a hearkening back, right, to ancestral spiritual traditions that predate slavery, right, that have been adopted into contemporary, right, Black spiritual traditions, whether they're, you know, Christian, Muslim, right, voodoo, like, you know, all Yeah, so just really thinking about like ancestry is sort of all up and through, and memory is sort of all up and through, I think, those land relations and those reclamations.
We have time. Okay, I have one.
Yeah.
I know, maybe final question. So in thinking about our current moment,
I'm glad you're asking this question.
yeah, there's much to despair in our current moment. But also there have been other historical moments, right? Where, particularly for Black folks, right? There have been assaults on, Black life, land, and rights. In addition to like any number of other groups and intersections of identity. And so I'm curious, one, if you have found this work to be kind of more invigorating during this moment, or kind of like wishing that you were kind of studying something else in this moment, as we're kind of seeing, the protections of even just National Park Service's complicated history, though it may have, right? And then also kind of just like where you're finding guidance or models, optimism for kind of enduring through this moment as a kind of person in the world, but also as a academic studying some of these things.
Thank you for that. I am actually like, I know this might seem bizarre, but I'm kind of like invigorated in this moment. And like not because like I don't have a lot of despair. It's not that. It's more that I think it's really, really important in moments like this. And I've never lived through a moment like this, right? Like most of us alive have not lived through moments quite like this, our parents, maybe grandparents. But I think that like memory is so important right now, right? Like the whole purpose, right, of this moment, I think, for the Trump administration is to make us forget or to scare us into erasure, right? And so for me, it's actually like I'm like honestly in like invigorated and also overwhelmed by like how much, right, like I want to write and to cover and to try to like share about these histories. I mean, there's the gutting, right, of the National Park Service. There's the opening up of the US forests now for increased logging and mining and all sorts of things, which are all kind of, which are all deeply extractive and disturbing things that are happening. And, every time I look back at this, story of Teddy Roosevelt, I'm just like, there was like a whole other, like this in itself is an enclosure and a capturing of land in itself, right? Like the parks and the forests as they exist now, right, are like representations of conquest. This is just a kind of further continuum, right, of the same. And so what that means for me actually is, when things like this happen, these spaces are under contestation, right? I don't know all of what the Trump administration intends for all of these public lands, but to me, it's actually like the exact time when we should be pushing for it to become something different altogether, right? And not just the kind of like back to like I think then that I think the aim is to make us be like, oh, we're so scared that we'll go back to the National Park Service, or we'll go back to the US Forest Service. And I'm just like, was that serving us, right? Like what would actually serve this, serve us in this moment, right? And not just Black folks, right? Indigenous folks, like I think there's, a real call for like visioning at this moment of like, what else could happen with these lands besides what these folks' agenda are, right? Like they're not the only people with power. And so that's sort of where I am. I'm a cog in the wheel, right? But like I really am like, we could be articulating another vision for these lands too. And like, why don't we do that actually? And, we may not win all of it, but like why advocate for the status quo when these folks are advocating for their dreams, right? Their ideals. And where are we? What are we advocating for? So that's really where I am right now. I'm just like, okay, well, if you're gonna put this up for grabs, like let's put up some other stuff up for grabs right now. And I think that, some folks might think that that is dangerous. And I'm just like, this is the most risky time ever. And if there was ever a moment to push with all that you have for what you actually really want, I think it's this time, right? Not when it's like quote unquote safe. So for me as an academic, it just means that I'm overwhelmed, I lose sleep. And I'm trying to overcome that overwhelm to do what Miriam Kaba like asked us to do always, right? It's like get out of the mode of just thinking, right? And taking one step, pick an arena, right? Pick a lane and get in it, right? And if you're passionate about it, like go full throttle in it because now is the time,